They told us to look at history and see survival, to see chains broken, to see laws changed, to see progress, and to be grateful for how far things have come. But if you sit with it a little longer, if you look past the surface, you start to notice something else, something quieter, something deeper, something they don't emphasize. Because this story has never just been about survival, it's been about power. Think about it. After everything's done to black people, after centuries of systems designed to erase identity, to extract labor, to suppress intelligence, to rewrite narratives, after all of that, the real question isn't, how did we survive? That's the version everyone is comfortable asking. The softer version, the safer version. But the real question is this: how are we still building? What does a people go from being denied literacy to producing scholars? From being excluded from institutions to creating institutions? From being told they're less than human to shaping the very systems that define humanity today? That's not just survival. That's something else entirely. Because survival means you made it out. But building, creating, innovating, that means you made something out of it. And that changes the conversation completely. We've been shown a very specific version of progress, a polished one, a curated one that highlights outcomes, but rarely examines origins. We're shown skyscrapers, but not always the hands that built them. We're shown medical breakthroughs, but not always the minds behind them. We're shown technology, but not always the people who made it possible. It's presented like everything just evolved, naturally, as if society moved forward, because it was always meant to, as if the system worked the way it should have, for everyone. But that's not the full story, not even close, because behind that version of progress is another reality, one that isn't as comfortable to sit with, one that raises harder questions. How do you contribute to a system that refuses to recognize you? How do you innovate when access itself is restricted? How do you create at a high level while being systematically pushed to the margins? And more importantly, how do you keep doing it over and over and over again? Because that's the part that often gets skipped. The consistency, the persistence, the refusal to stop. Black people were not building from a place of advantage. They were building from a place of resistance. Denied education, denied capital, denied patents, denied protection, denied basic rights. And still, they produced ideas that reshaped industries. They developed methods that saved lives. They influenced culture on a global scale. They expanded possibilities for people who didn't even look like them. And here's where it gets even more complex, because it wasn't just about creating. It was about creating an environment where recognition wasn't guaranteed, where credit could be taken, where contributions could be minimized or erased entirely. Imagine building something powerful and watching someone else take ownership of it. Imagine solving a problem and not being allowed to claim the solution. Imagine pushing humanity forward while being told you're holding it back. That contradiction is part of the story too, but even that didn't stop the output. It didn't slow the innovation. It didn't silence the impact. Because when something is deeply rooted, it doesn't rely on permission to exist. It shows up anyway. And that's what makes this conversation different. Because this isn't just about acknowledging contribution. It's about recognizing the conditions under which those contributions were made. It's about understanding that progress, as we know it, wasn't just built in comfort. A lot of it was built in pressure. And pressure does two things. It can break something, or it can refine it. What we've seen over generations is a pattern of refinement, of taking limitation and turning it into leverage, of taking exclusion and turning it into innovation, of taking adversity and turning it into impact. But that doesn't mean it was easy. It doesn't mean it was fair. And it definitely doesn't mean it should have happened that way. Because there's a difference between celebrating resilience and ignoring the reason resilience was necessary. This isn't about romanticizing struggle. It's about telling the truth about it, clearly, honestly, without reducing it to a motivational quote. Because when you strip everything down, when you remove the polished narratives, the simplified timelines, the comfortable summaries, you're left with something much more powerful. A reality where a people were placed at the bottom of a system and still found ways to influence the top of it, not occasionally, not temporarily, but consistently, across generations, across industries, across continents. And that's what shifts the perspective, because once you see that clearly, you can't reduce a story to just survival anymore. You start to recognize patterns, patterns of contribution, patterns of innovation, patterns of leadership, patterns of impact, even in places where the spotlight wasn't shining. And that leads to a bigger realization, one that changes how you interpret everything that follows. Black people didn't just exist within history, they actively shaped it, not always from positions of power, but often in spite of the absence of it. And that distinction matters, because it reframes the narrative, it moves it away from limitation and toward influence. So when we talk about progress, we have to ask better questions. Not just what was built, but who built it. Not just when did things change, but who pushed that change forward. Not just how did we get here, but who made here possible. Because when you start answering those questions honestly, you begin to see something that was always there, but not always acknowledged. This isn't just a story of endurance. It's not just a story of overcoming. It's a story of creation under pressure. A story of impact without recognition. A story of progress driven from the margins. And once you understand that, you realize something important. The foundation of the modern world is more layered than we were taught. And some of the people who helped build that foundation were never meant to be seen doing it, but they did it anyway. And that's where the story really begins. Before oppression became the headline, there was power, not hidden, not secondary, not struggling to exist, but structured, organized, thriving. Because one of the biggest distortions in history is not just what was erased, but where the story begins. For many people, Black history starts with slavery, with chains, with ships, with loss, as if that's the origin point, as if everything before that was empty or insignificant. But that version of history is not just incomplete, it's misleading, because long before colonization, long before forced displacement, there were systems, there were empires, there were networks of trade, education, governance, and innovation operating at a level the world rarely acknowledges. In the year 1324, a moment unfolded that would quietly disrupt global perception. A man began a journey across the Sahara Desert, not alone, but with a caravan so vast, it stretched beyond the horizon. Thousands of people, scholars, soldiers, merchants, and with them, an unimaginable amount of gold. His name was Mansa Musa, often described as the wealthiest individual to ever live. But focusing only on his wealth misses the point, because gold was not his legacy, knowledge was. As he traveled through regions like Cairo, his presence did more than impress. It shifted economies, it disrupted markets, it forced entire systems to react to the scale of what they were witnessing. But what he chose to do with that influence is what matters. He invested in learning. He funded mosques, built schools, established centers of intellectual exchange. He turned cities like Timbuktu into destinations for scholars from across the known world, at a time when much of the world was still consolidating power through conquest. This was power expressed through education. Imagine that for a second. A city filled with libraries, with manuscripts, with students studying law, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, not imported knowledge, but developed, preserved, and expanded within African institutions. This wasn't accidental. It wasn't temporary. It was intentional civilization. And it didn't start with him. Centuries before Mali's rise, along the Nile River, another figure had already begun, reshaping what human potential could look like. His name was Imhotep. He wasn't born into power. He rose into it, through intellect, through vision, through the ability to see solutions where others saw limits. By day, he designed structures that would outlast empires. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara, one of the first monumental stone buildings in human history, a blueprint that would influence architecture for generations. By night, he practiced medicine, diagnosing, treating, documenting methods so advanced that centuries later, they would still be studied. architecture and medicine, two entirely different disciplines, mastered by one mind. And yet, for many, his name is barely mentioned. That's the pattern again. Presence, without proportionate recognition. Impact, without equal visibility. But if you zoom out, you start to see that these weren't isolated cases. They were part of a broader reality. Across the African continent, innovation wasn't rare. It was normal. In different regions, different systems were evolving simultaneously. Engineering techniques that didn't rely on materials others considered essential. Mathematical systems that operated on entirely different numerical foundations. Astronomical observations that mapped patterns in the sky with striking precision. Communities weren't just surviving their environment. They were studying it, understanding it, adapting it, and then building on top of that understanding. This wasn't guesswork. It was method. It was discipline. It was knowledge passed down, refined, and expanded over time. But here's what makes this part of the story important. Because when people only see the struggle, they assume that's all there was. When people only see the disruption, they forget there was something to disrupt. There was structure before instability. There was identity before distortion. There was power before it was challenged. And that context matters, because it changes how everything else is interpreted. Without it, resilience looks like reaction. With it, resilience looks like continuation. A continuation of intelligence, of creativity, of innovation, even under different conditions. So when history shifts into narratives of oppression, it's not the beginning of the story. It's an interruption of it. An interruption that tried to redefine identity, to limit potential, to reposition contribution as coincidence instead of consistency. But even interruptions don't erase foundations, because what was built before doesn't just disappear. It leaves traces in knowledge, in culture, in systems, in ways of thinking. And those traces have a way of resurfacing, sometimes subtly, sometimes powerfully, but always persistently. So when we talk about Black excellence, it's not something that suddenly appeared. It's not something that started under pressure. It's something that existed long before that. What changed was the environment around it, and that's a distinction that reshapes the entire narrative. Because once you understand that there was power before struggle, you stop seeing achievement as an exception and start recognizing it as a pattern that didn't begin in limitation, but continued despite it. And that sets the stage for what comes next. Because when everything changes, the real question isn't whether that brilliance disappears. Then, everything shifted. Not gradually, not gently, but forcefully. Systems that once supported growth were replaced with systems designed to control it. Movement became restricted. Knowledge became policed. Identity became rewritten. This wasn't just disruption. It was restructuring, a deliberate attempt to take something established and reposition it at the bottom of a new order. Slavery, colonization, segregation, different forms, same intention, to extract value while suppressing visibility, to benefit from intelligence while denying its source, to control contribution without acknowledging ownership. And on the surface, it looked like it worked. Generations forced into labor, communities separated, histories fragmented. But underneath that surface, something else was happening. Because even in conditions designed to limit growth, growth didn't stop. It adapted. In environments where education was denied, knowledge didn't disappear. It went underground, passed quietly, shared intentionally, preserved in ways that systems couldn't easily erase. In places where communication was restricted, expression didn't end. It evolved into songs, into rhythms, into coded language that carried meaning beyond what was heard. In spaces where ownership wasn't allowed, creation still happened. Not always documented, not always credited, but present, consistent, unavoidable. And this is where the narrative becomes difficult to ignore. Because if a system is designed to suppress something, and that thing still continues to show up, then the system didn't fully succeed. It only changed the conditions. In 1791, one moment made that reality impossible to overlook. On an island in the Caribbean, Enslaved men and women gathered in secret, not for survival, not for negotiation, but for decision, the decision to resist. What followed became known as the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in recorded history, and it wasn't symbolic, it wasn't contained, it wasn't easily dismissed. It was organized, strategic, relentless, led by figures like Toussaint Louverture, who understood both the system he was fighting against and the mindset required to dismantle it. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a complete shift in power. Armies were defeated, empires were challenged, assumptions were shattered, because for the first time at that scale, people who were considered property proved they could become leaders, not eventually, not theoretically, but in real time. And the message spread far beyond that island. It reached governments, it reached slave owners, it reached oppressed people across continents, and it introduced a truth that systems had tried to avoid. Control is not permanent. That moment didn't just change Haiti, it changed perception. It forced the world to confront a contradiction. How do you justify a system when the people within it prove they can't function without it? And once that question is raised, it doesn't go away. But resistance wasn't always loud. It wasn't always revolutionary. Sometimes it looked like survival, everyday survival, on plantations, in fields, in households. Black individuals found ways to maintain fragments of autonomy. They applied agricultural knowledge, brought from Africa, techniques for cultivating crops, managing land, understanding seasons. They practiced crafts, ironworking, carpentry, textile production, skills that would later become foundations for economic independence. They developed healing methods, using natural resources, combining traditional knowledge with observation and adaptation. Even in constrained environments, there was learning, there was experimentation, there was improvement, and then there was something even more powerful: connection. Families were separated, but community didn't disappear. New systems of support were formed, shared responsibility, collective care, cultural preservation. Language was maintained in fragments, traditions were adapted, stories were passed down, because identity, even when pressured, finds ways to persist, and persistence creates continuity. So when freedom began to emerge, it didn't come into a vacuum. It met a people who had already been building internally. By the time legal structures started to shift, the foundation for growth was already there. After emancipation, what happened next surprised many. Within a short period, Black communities began organizing, establishing schools, creating businesses, participating in governance, not from scratch, but from accumulated knowledge that had been carried through generations. This is the part that challenges assumptions, because if people who were denied access can rapidly build systems once given space, then the limitation was never ability, it was restriction. And once restriction is removed, capacity becomes visible. But visibility brings resistance. Progress was met with backlash, violence, policy changes, new systems designed to limit advancement again. Different structure, same pattern, and still, the momentum didn't fully stop, because by this point, something had already been proven: that brilliance doesn't depend on environment to exist. It may be slowed, redirected, hidden, but not eliminated. And that realization sets the stage for everything that follows. Because once a people prove they can build under pressure, the question changes again. It's no longer, can they create? Once breakthrough becomes inevitable, everything changes, because history reaches a point where suppression is no longer enough, where containment starts to fail, where limitation starts to crack, and what was once hidden begins to surface, not slowly, but across multiple spaces at once, in science, in culture, in leadership, in global influence. Black excellence stops being something that exists in the background and becomes something the world has to see, not as an exception, but as a pattern. Because once barriers begin to shift, what was always there no longer needs to hide. In laboratories, in classrooms, in studios, on global stages, Black individuals start redefining what's possible, not by asking for space, but by occupying it. And in doing so, they exposed something important. The gap was never talent. It was access. Give access, and the results speak. Across technology, medicine, engineering, contributions expand, not in isolation, but at scale. Innovations that shape daily life. Systems people rely on, without even realizing where they came from. And at the same time, culture begins to shift globally. Music changes, language changes, style changes. What starts in one community moves across borders, across continents, until it becomes global. Not because it was handed to the world, but because it was undeniable. And this is where influence becomes undeniable too. Because culture doesn't just entertain, it informs, it shapes perception, it shifts conversations, and suddenly, voices that were once ignored are now setting direction. But visibility doesn't mean the struggle disappears, because even as progress becomes visible, resistance adapts, new barriers form, different systems emerge, less obvious, more subtle, but still present. Inequality doesn't vanish, it evolves. And yet, so does the response, because each generation builds on what the previous one established. From civil rights movements to global advocacy, Black voices continue pushing systems to confront themselves, not just for recognition, but for accountability. Moments arise that force the world to pause, to reflect, to question. Conversations that once stayed local become global, and once again, change is driven from the same place it always has been, pressure. But this time, the pressure is visible. It's organized, amplified, impossible to ignore. And through it, systems begin to adjust. Not perfectly, not completely, but noticeably. Because when enough truth surfaces, it becomes harder to deny. And still, the contributions continue. In leadership, figures emerge who represent possibilities once considered unreachable. In science, boundaries continue to expand. In global institutions, representation shifts, not as a favor, but as a reflection of what has always been present. And that's what makes this moment different. Because now, Black excellence is no longer something that has to be proven. It's something that has to be acknowledged. But even with that, the story doesn't end here. Because progress is not a final destination. It's a continuous process, and the same patterns still exist. Inequities in education, in healthcare, in opportunity. But I like to uncle onto those challenges. There's something equally consistent. Advancement, not accidental, not occasional, but intentional. Because when a people understand what they've carried, what they've built, what they've survived, and what they've contributed, they move differently, with awareness, with direction, with purpose. And that brings us back to the question from the beginning. After everything that was taken, what remained? Not just survival, but intelligence, creativity, innovation, leadership, resilience. The things that systems tried to suppress, but couldn't fully remove. Because those things were never dependent on permission. They were intrinsic. And that's the part of the story that matters most. Not just what was lost, but what couldn't be taken. Because when something continues to show up, across generations, across conditions, across obstacles, that's not coincidence, that's foundation. And when a foundation is that strong, even disruption can't erase it. It can only delay it. So this isn't just a story about the past. It's a reflection of the present and a signal toward the future. Because the same force that built under pressure is the same force still shaping the world today. And the more clearly that's understood, the harder it becomes to ignore. So no, this was never just about survival. It was always about power.